Great, and just welcome to our virtual roundtable from the Vermont Historical Society. I'm Eileen Corcoran. I'm the Community Outreach Manager at VHS, and excited to have folks here today. Just a couple of points. You all are sort of unmuted right now, so we do appreciate if people mute themselves when they're not talking, just to avoid any background noises or anything like that. Obviously, you're welcome to use the group chat function for any questions or any comments as we go along. And again, we will be recording this, so that recording will be available afterwards on our YouTube channel. And so that's always, if you want to refer to it again or let anybody else know about this, it's a great time to do so. So I'm going to turn it over now to Teresa Greene, who is the Collections Manager at VHS, to talk about deaccessioning. I liked your post today, social media, calling it your accidental specialty. So I thought that was fantastic. And so we look forward to hearing about it.
Yeah, all right. So I am going to start with a presentation in PowerPoint just as an overview, and then open it up for discussion. And if we have no discussion, I've prepped some questions. Okay, let me share my screen with you. All right, so I'm going to quickly go over some of the basics and tell you the system that I've developed here at the Vermont Historical Society. I've loosely structured this around the questions when, why, what, and how. When you should go through deaccessioning, why deaccessioning is a good thing to do, what you should deaccession, and how the process works. Oh no, my buttons don't work. Okay, there we go. All right, so the first part, when. When it comes to deaccessioning, there are two schools of thought, both of which popped up in the late 1980s, early 90s in archives. The first held that deaccessioning should be a normal process that you undertook as part of your regular collections maintenance. And then the other one held that deaccessioning should only be done as a form of crisis management, like if you run out of space, not financial crisis. So the benefit of the first school, having it be part of your regular maintenance, is that you have a lot more flexibility at the beginning of the process, the time of accession. And this is especially helpful for institutions collecting history as it happens, which is something that we do. You try to anticipate what's going to be important in the future, but you're not always right. So for example, if you collect a bunch of election paraphernalia for someone who ends up losing and then goes on to live a very boring life, so if you're constantly reevaluating, you have some freedom collecting these types of objects because you have the knowledge that if you're not 100% right, you're not completely, totally locked in. The benefit to the second school is a bit more ephemeral. It falls back on the assumption that since museums are holding things in public trust, they're making a promise that they will keep and preserve them forever. So as such, deaccessioning should only be done as a very last resort when you are literally incapable of keeping the promise that you made at accession. So here I've added the arguments against each side. For the normal process side, keeping it as a normal part of your process, you can fall into the habit of over-accessioning or accession things in bad faith, where you start saying, oh, we can just get rid of it in 5 years, which is not a mindset that we want to have. For the crisis management side, you want to avoid getting into crises in the first place, because then we may end up turning away important objects while we get things under control. And since ethically all collection objects need to be treated with the same respect and importance, objects that do not fit the mission or might not be as rare as some others may end up hogging resources. Resources in this case being staff time, conservation funds, and of course space. So why is deaccessioning a necessity? If you work at a museum or have ever been behind the scenes at one, these will be pretty obvious. Everyone has resource issues. Space is finite and always a concern. If your museum is more than 10 years old, the mission and collecting focus has likely seen some changes, sometimes dramatically. And your museum probably went through a, sorry, I have to let people in. I think it worked. Okay. So if your museum's more than 10 years old, your mission has likely changed over time, almost certainly. And you also probably went through like a free love phase in the 1970s where you accepted every donation that came through the door. Some things may seem less obvious unless you're really working in collections. And it's that more objects means less accessibility, which is bad for the institution, the public, and the objects. So unless you have perfect data records, what objects get used for exhibition, research, publication, etc., tends to be limited to what your staff knows about. So your usable collection size is limited to the size and capabilities of your staff, both in terms of personally interacting and remembering objects and in maintaining and updating your database to be able to quickly find relevant objects. If you have too many, especially too many out of mission objects, the useful and relevant ones tend to get buried. And I like to view collection storage less like an attic where you hide things out of the way and more like a library. The whole point of having things in there is for people to be able to use them for research or inspiration or exhibition, what have you. So if they can't be used, they aren't being served, and then we as a museum are failing both the objects and the public. I was showing you all the wrong slides, sorry. Now we're onto this slide, which is what to deaccession. At the Vermont Historical Society, our mission is preserving and sharing the history of Vermont and its people. So I developed a rating system that assigns points to each object that will ultimately give them all a letter grade, A, B, C, D, and F, just like in school. So if an object gets 90 to 100 points, it gets an A, 80 to 89 is a B, etc. This is accompanied by a giant report that explains all the nuances of the letter grade, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who wants to see it. Since the most important aspect for us is whether something was made or used in Vermont, and we're primarily interested in telling the history, the most important parts for us are the provenance and the context. So telling the stories the objects can tell rather than stuff like something's artistic merit. So to that end, the points, before I go, where it says verified history, what I mean by verified in this context is that we either have documentation showing it or we have a family history that hasn't been disproven by genealogy or examination of the object. So for example, if they say this belonged to George Washington, but it dates to the 1930s, you can rule out that history. But then we also don't want to rule out histories of people who have not been written down, so disenfranchised groups. So you get 90 points if you have a Vermont history and it's attached to a famous person or an event, like Governor Coonan's inaugural gown or Calvin Coolidge's toddy glasses. 80 points if it's got a Vermont history and tells a story, like the carving tools of a local granite carver. 70 points for Vermont history without a story, like carving tools that were probably used here and we don't know who used them. 60 points for a possible Vermont history. So that's if a thing belonged to a donor's great-grandmother and they have 4 great-grandmothers and only 2 of them lived in Vermont. And then 0 points for no Vermont history. And this unfortunately has to include things that have completely lost their provenances. So if something came in and the donor said, this belonged to my grandfather who was this person and lived here, and no one wrote it down, it now has no provenance. And no matter how much research we do, we're never going to be able to find out what it is. So it ceases being a Vermont object. Another example for us, since we're not focused on decorative arts, is things that were collected by people in Vermont. So for example, it was real popular to collect sandwich glass cup plates because they're only about this big, and you would collect one of every pattern. And we have been given a couple of those collections, and they were at one point in their life owned in Vermont, but their original context was not Vermont. All right, and I wanted to really quickly show these 2 graphs. The one on the left shows the dispersal of our collection right now. It's quite heavy in Fs, mostly things that have no provenance written down. And then it's heavy in Bs because those are objects that have no story but are in good condition. So they got an extra 10 points, which bumped them from a C to a B. And that includes things like soda bottles that were manufactured here, medicine bottles that were manufactured here. So we can provably place them in Vermont, but they're just kind of objects. And the graph on the right shows my ultimate goals. And we're still quite heavy on the Bs because of those good conditions objects that don't have stories. In an ideal world, we would be completely As, but I don't think even the Met is completely good quality objects that 100% fit your mission and tell interesting stories. All right, so how do you deaccession things? The first step is to write down your whole process in your collections policy. And the next one is more of a cover your butt type things. If you sell something, you have to be able to prove that you own it, which is why deeds of gift are so important. And we do have abandoned property laws, but they are such a pain. You do have to take into consideration idealism versus realism, though. If you have a whole bunch of broken baby doll heads in your collection that you need to deaccession, but you can't find their deeds of gift, no one's going to sue you and say, those are really my broken baby doll heads, and you have no right to sell them. So you probably don't need to go and find your deeds of gift for those. And the last is do not accept conditional gifts. A conditional gift is something where they donate it and say, I'm only donating this if you leave it on display forever, or if you never get rid of it, or this large collection, but the whole collection has to stay together. So just to make it easy on yourself and the future, just never accept those. And the method, in an ideal world, everything that is owned by a museum and gets deaccessioned will then go to another museum. So you would transfer it to another institution. This is not always practical because a lot of the times the things we're deaccessioning are trash. And so the second option is to sell on the open market. And the open market could either be an auction, so you would consign it to an auction house who would sell it for you, or something like eBay. We don't do eBay because it eats up so many staff resources that it really becomes a hindrance on the institution. And sometimes things can sit there for 2 years and you're still having to store it and spend resources on maintaining it while you're waiting for it to sell. And then the last one that we all hate is destruction. And that ties into things that you can't get an auction house to take. So if you have 100 fan tines and all of the fabric has melted away and all you have are the things, and no auction house is going to take it, and your only option is to throw them out. And then it also goes to things like firearms or Nazi paraphernalia. And with the Nazi stuff, you don't want to sell it to anyone who's going to want it. So your best option for that would be destruction. And the last part of my slide are 3 live, laugh, love things. There's an ideal way to do something, and it's almost never the way that you can do it. So you have to really balance idealism versus realism. And in that vein, when you're creating your accessions policy for the future, you have to assume good faith in people, because you end up otherwise handicapping them. So if you assume that the people coming after you are going to deaccession for nefarious purposes, then all of the rules that you put in makes any kind of deaccessioning impossible. I worked at a place before where you had to exhaust the possibility of transferring it to an institution before you could move on to the other 2 ways of disposal. And if we wanted to get rid of a bunch of World War II helmets, which every museum has a lot of, we had to email everyone who could have wanted it and then wait for them to respond. You never get responses. So I haven't been there in a while, and all that stuff at that institution, and all that stuff is still there waiting for a transfer. And then the last one is assume that you're going to die on your way home from work every day, because you don't want everything that you've accessioned this year to have to be assigned an F grade because you didn't write any of the provenance down. So always do things in a way that if you never came back to work and somebody who didn't know anything about it had to take it over, they could pick up where you left off. There's not a pile of deaccessioned objects sitting in a corner with no paperwork that then have to become FICs and reaccessioned back into the collection. Okay, so that is the end of my introductory part. Open it up for discussion. Does anyone have any questions or topics that you'd like to delve into?
Could you just go over, excuse me, that was so great. But could you go over maybe what your collection looks like? I'm not really familiar with your institution. So what it looks like and I guess the numbers and what it's broken up into.
Yeah, so we have a bit over 20,000 objects. It's a kind of encyclopedic collection focused on objects that were made and used in Vermont. And over the years, we have been pretty good at sticking with that. The biggest problem has been writing stuff down, or there was a period where we had a historic house that was interpreted through props, so we just kind of accessioned every ye oldie thing to fill it up. So those are some of our spots where there are things that don't fit within our mission, but it's from beginning of time to present Vermont history. We have a lot of ceramics and glass because we were bequeathed a collection of a historian who started collecting Vermontiana and then started collecting comparative objects. So we have all of that. That's a lot of ceramics and glass. But for the most part, it's quotidian objects that were used in Vermont. We're currently based in an old high school. The basement floor has been refitted to be collection storage, and we have 5 collection spaces.
Well, I think out of your whole presentation, I would love to see a copy of what you have typed up for your coding system. I guess I can only relate to this by comparing to my institution. And so right now we have a curator who's been there for 30 plus years. So our issue is that they're like they could walk in and remember everything. So it's been a slow process trying to kind of be like, you should write that down. We should all write this down. We should make that transition. But also a fan of the gentleman's agreements. So we have a lot of objects that have been put in a position where we have to return them even though we have legal title because of this agreement. So I guess maybe it goes back to deaccessioning ultimately, but have you ever had experience with that, or how would you suggest? Because what we have done is ended up returning the object just because of the nature of the political, I guess, how it could reflect on us. But I always wondered if there's a better way to do that with objects that we have in our collection that have conditional agreements.
Yeah, that is actually something that I've dealt with before. If the conditional agreement really is a gentleman's verbal agreement, the easiest way to go about that is to draft up your standard deed of gift and approach the person and say, we're just restructuring things. We want to make sure that everything's written down, and then see if they will agree to give it to you. And if they mention we want it returned, sometimes you can do that, but the best way to do that is to have it being a permanent loan. And you can define what permanent means. In most cases, it's a year, and it has to be renewed every year. And as part of the loan agreement, if they no longer own it, so if they die and pass it on to somebody or decide to nominally give it to their friend, they have to give you written notice. And so that you have a notice of who owns it. And if at any time you don't, so that person dies without a will and you can't determine which of their 8 kids it goes to, you then turn to the abandoned property law where you have to send them 3 letters and then post it in the newspaper. But make it clear up front, kind of, you don't word it like a threat, but if you kind of make it like a threat, like if you don't tell us who owns this, then we're going to do abandoned property laws. Most people will just give it to you. Just word it in a, we're redoing things and we just need everything written down, and people usually are okay with accepting that. But oftentimes it is easier to just give it back. The only problem then is getting them to actually come and pick it up.
A large portion of our collection are vessels and boats. So if you could imagine, I think a lot of it, the emotional attachment to boating is something that I did not fully understand or could wrap my head around prior to coming here. They're expensive. I mean, they're expensive to keep floating, and people, it's craziness. So that helps a lot. So thank you.
Well, if there's nothing real specific, I put together a. Oh yeah.
I have a question. I'm the collections manager at the Bennington Museum, and we're closed. We're using this time to reassess our mission, reassess everything. And one of the things that I very much am planning on doing is writing an actual collections plan for us. We have a collections management policy, of course, but a collections development plan. And I had done Rainey Tisdale's active collections workshop up in Barrie last year, and it was absolutely wonderful. I absolutely adore her and all of the ideas that she espouses. One of the problems that we have is that we also have large amounts of glass, which we are in the process of deaccessioning. We've already deaccessioned several very large collections. If anyone's interested in goblets, let me know. Nobody is. We also have the cut plates though and everything else.
Yeah.
One of the problems that I anticipate, we, in our most recent collections management policy, wrote in that we will notify donors or their first generation heirs when we deaccession things. And for most of the stuff, these people are all long dead, so it's not something I'm going to have to do. I have a bad feeling that once we start getting into other parts of the collection that are a little bit more questionable, that I'm certainly going to have to write some of these letters, and I am certain that some of these people are going to get back to me because they are the kind of people who come and visit their grandfather's stuff regularly. And I am not good at talking to these people. I mean, I try to make that our director's job or the curator's job or someone other than me. So I was wondering what advice you had, what language perhaps you have crafted, and what ideas you have to deal with these, wonderful people who just love their stuff and are so happy that their stuff is in your museum and being cared for. And I feel so bad telling these people that, no, actually we no longer want it. We're going to send it away to auction and sell it. And yes, this money will be used for better things, but yeah, your great-grandfather's collection of 1,200 goblets is just not something anybody wants to see anymore.
Mm-hmm. So I've not dealt exactly with your situation. I was always taught to work into your collections policy that you do not notify and you don't give first refusal to donors and their families. But I have seen where you can set up, usually it's put into the deed of gift that if an object is accessioned and sold, then the proceeds go into a named fund. So all of these goblets, you sell them for X amount of money, and then whatever you accession with those gets the tagline funded by, and then still has the donor's name so that they still get recognition for their donation, even though it's not their specific object. And that I've only seen it used in the context of collectors. So not like this was my grandma's wedding dress, but if it was a goblet or a goblet collection or a cut plate collection, something that doesn't really have that emotional significance, it may still be an effective way to deal with it. Especially if you don't, I've always found that if you ask somebody if it's okay or if they want to choose between two things, then they're never satisfied. But if you tell them that you're doing something and that it's a great beneficial thing, then they'll be happy. So if you send the letter saying, thank you so much for your grandfather's gift of X amount of dollars of goblets, we are able to put that through to accessioning this very important blah, blah, blah. And every time that it's displayed, his name will be in tangent with it. Does that help?
That does, yes. I mean, at some point we were going to start, I hope, deaccessioning some of the wedding dresses because, again, God, we have so many of them, and some of them are just not, they are not related. We collect Bennington-related stuff or Vermont-related stuff. And we have wedding dresses from people who had summer homes in Bennington in their old age and then gave the Bennington Museum their wedding dress because, of course, they did.
Yeah.
And they're wonderful, but they're not, they don't belong here. And everybody has so many wedding dresses. I mean, even if I went back to the place where this woman got married, I can't imagine that they want another wedding dress because we all does. So I realize there's no actual answer to this question. I'm just trying to figure out what other people are doing to deal with it.
Yeah, well, my last position, I was a curator of textiles, so I did have to deal with a lot of wedding dresses and all of that. And what I found helpful is I made sure to document every time that somebody asked to come in to see something, especially things that aren't made available on your online web portal. So it would have to be something that somebody's personally kept track of to come and see. And I know that you don't have your wedding dresses searchable on your website. So if you have a wedding dress that got dropped off and has never been visited, you're probably safe to deaccession it, and their descendants likely don't have any memory, a family memory that it's there at the Bennington Museum.
Well, we have all of our collections, well, almost all of our collections are available through the website. We have done that part of the process, so we're good there.
Okay.
And I do want to be as open as possible about this. I'm not trying to get stuff deaccessioned out the back door. And,
right. Don't be sneaky.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's what you're suggesting. Yeah, a lot of these things I don't think anybody is going to come back for because the reason why we're deaccessioning is that it's kind of junky to begin with.
Yeah.
But I feel bad. I personally feel guilty when I go and I read these donor letters and these people from, 50 years ago were just so grateful that we were going to preserve their grandmother's cup plates or their wedding dress or whatever it was. So it's just a personal guilt problem, I guess, too.
Yeah, that can be something that is difficult to deal with. What helps me is getting overwhelmed in numbers. After the 15th one, then my empathy turns off. But with that situation of giving keeping the name attached to the funds that you get, that does run into the problem of then you can't use them for direct care unless it's a large enough sum that it can conserve an entire object, and you could say conservation provided for. So that does limit you to only using them for further accessions.
So how do you keep track of all of these funds? Because I'm thinking a lot of this stuff is we're going to sell it and it's, maybe we'll get $5 for it. Mm-hmm. I mean, a collection of 1,200 goblets, yes, that'll be a substantial chunk. It won't be all that substantial because nobody wants goblets these days. But like some of this glass, we will get good money for, and it will be enough that we can buy something nice. But for some of these things, it's going to be a lot of, you know, a $5 something there. And despite the fact that it's only a $5 piece of whatever it is, I have a bad feeling that at some point someone is going to come back and want to know what happened to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you keep track of that, and how do you manage having reasonable credit lines when you're selling things that are not great objects and not bringing a lot of money?
So we don't do the named credit lines for funds unless it's a significant amount. But all of the deaccession funds get put under their own, it's a code for us, the is it FABC, the accountants group for museums suggests putting them in their own separate account so you don't accidentally use them. And when it's smaller things and you're asked for an account of how you've been using the funds, what I've done in the past is keep a record of what all deaccession funds have done and then find something that's monetarily comparable. Because we also don't earmark it based on type. So if we're deaccessioning glass, it's not earmarked for glass accession or conservation. It's the entire collection, which is handy. The thing that becomes more difficult is when it's not a deaccession, it's a donation that is earmarked for conservation, like $300 for conservation of a quilt. And then what kind of pieces of that conservation you can use the $300 towards. But we have not, I'm trying to think back to any of the places that I've been, and I can't think of one where we deaccession something for a low value and then we're asked to account for that particular fund.
Okay.
Teresa, could you talk about what your deaccession policy is at where you are now? And so we have to go through our curatorial committee, which is actually rather large in my opinion. I think we have about 18 people of various different backgrounds. And so sometimes, even if we're deaccessioning something so trivial that's not even, there's no information, I think some people get the impression they're like, oh no, like, you know, that initial panic. So what does that look like for you guys, and how do you address that, I guess?
Yeah, I actually prepped a slide of arguments. So our deaccession policy here at the VHS, and really any of the places that I've worked before, directly mirrors our accession policy. So for us, it starts with me. Somebody will either bring in something to donate, or I'll spot something in collections that we don't need. I bring a list to our director who he weeds whatever out that he wants to, and then we have a subcommittee of our board that then has to approve everything. And we haven't formally outlined the that you have to talk to X number of institutions before you can go. That's largely up to us, which is good, because then we can actually get things out the door. But it's the same subcommittee that accessions things. And let me share my screen for my, sorry, just give me half of a second. Nope, wrong one. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, you guys. There it is. Okay. So our board here is pretty understanding. At my last place, we didn't have to present to the board, but we presented to a committee of curators that had a lot of panic. They ideally wanted to deaccession, knew that we had to, but then when it came down to actually doing it, there were a lot of emotions involved in that process. So what I found useful is a couple strategies. The first one is to overwhelm them with how much you have. So if you have Bennington Museum will get a kick out of this. We have a lot of Parian that was accessioned under the thought that it was made in Vermont and has since been proven that it's English. And we have like 8 shelves of it. And if we just came out with the 3 that we want to deaccession, then there's the why are we doing this? But if you bring all of them out and say, this is the part that we want to deaccession, and you don't have to physically bring them all out. I've done this on PowerPoint several times. That helps a lot. Another one is to speak to them outside of a museum mindset. A lot of times people on the board that I've had the most trouble with are people with accounting or business backgrounds, that don't really see the behind the scenes of museums. So speaking to them in numbers and stats has been helpful. So I did 2 examples. The top one is that textile storage needs to be expanded by 30% to safely store all our objects, or the collections needs to be reduced by 30%. And I have actually made that specific argument, and the way to illustrate is to bring out an important object in your collection that is being stored incorrectly and show how it is actively hurting the collection, and then throw numbers. So the cost of expanding it would be $1.5 million. The cost of conservation for textiles is about $25,000 an object. But the cost of deaccessioning is negligible compared to those. So if they say no now, these are the numbers that they're going to be facing later. And the second one comes from another time where we were trying to accession a Kentucky sugar chest, and then it turned out that the price of that was $125,000, which we just didn't have. So we had to turn down this important thing, and it went to a private collector. These objects in the example are made up. I don't think that Calvin Coolidge had a carousel horse in his wedding, but if he did, we would want it. But it is an object that the museum has recently used for a large piece that was taking up a lot of room, not in storage, but in display space, because that's where it was and it was too big to move. And then my last one is to have all of your alternates ready. And it's a lot of work ahead of time, but often the first question that you'll get when I want to deaccession this thing is, do we have others of those? So if you have them already, then it tends to go fast. Because if you say, I'll bring this to you again the next time, you have to start over from the beginning, because you're going to get all the same questions again. So this is actually an object that I do want to deaccession. And we don't need it for several reasons. We can tell the story of the person who owned it because we have other things that were owned by her, some of which were actually made by her. We have things that were owned within the same town that have better stories. We have other full tea services if we were afraid that we might do a tea service display and needed a full service. And we have things that are visually similar that have better stories. And then this last one is to stem it from the accession process. And as museum people, this isn't a mentality that we want to have on ourselves when we're considering accessioning things, but it is helpful when you're dealing with people from a business or accounting background, is to put every accession in to monetary terms. So an example of something that we recently dealt with was a modern mass-produced souvenir that was not made in Vermont, but had the word Vermont on it. So if we look at what it costs to accession something, which I guessed at around $210, and then what we would use the object for, which would be not much because we already have other examples, we don't get the equivalent amount of worth from it, and that can stop the free love, accept everything that comes into the door mentality. And I think that's the last. Yep. Have either of you used any good arguments dealing with any non-museum boards?
I think often I find myself going to the networking, and maybe that's just like of the mindset that I'm in, but loaning from other institutions, even though sometimes it's a little bit more risky and chaotic. I've found we work with the Navy a lot, and that is its own situation, but being like, yeah, well, we could tell this story in other ways, and then also it provides us with the opportunity for loans and opening up that conversation. That's it.
Yeah, no, that's one that I hadn't used before. I tend to be at places that don't want to take loans, which is its own issue. But it is a good way to build your museum network.
Well, and I think that that's also
I tend to try to stick,
network.
never mind.
As far as knowing what other institutions have that are sort of similar or that are doing things that you can make that argument as well. If we don't have to have a copy because these folks have a copy.
Yeah.
Sort of sharing the load amongst ourselves, I think is another sort of argument that we can make.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I will say, I guess now I'm like thinking I'm arguing with myself too, because very like similar to Vermont Historical that's for the whole state, and we're the Chesapeake Bay, like that whole regional history. Maybe that's a different conversation, a different roundtable discussion, but when you're trying to interpret a regional history, it's so broad. So we have found ourselves growing to an extent where we've now almost become like a repository for other institutions. So where we would benefit from getting loans from like Talbot Historical or I don't know, other smaller museums, we find ourselves growing too quickly almost to where we can't. I don't know. It's such an interesting. We're growing, and I'm there during this transition period. So, trying to figure out how to help others around us, but also kind of being that pillar. I don't know if you guys have if you've experienced a similar thing. But we're actually encountering a lot of that right now with oral histories and trying to become a repository for the Upper Bay area. But also understanding that we can't collect everything, we can't save everything. So I don't know if that's a situation you've come across or how to deal with that, or if you have any advice.
Yeah, you mentioned oral histories, and that's something we've recently been emailing about because we've started collecting COVID-19 related resources, primarily on the library side. We're not accepting physical things until after everything's over. But we've decided to consciously not accept oral histories because there's another repository in the state that is actively doing that. And we don't need to be in competition with each other. We can split resources and thus collect more together. But we do have, as part of our mission, supporting the local historical societies. So when it comes to physical collection, if a local historical society doesn't have the resources to maintain a collection, we're their loaning repository. But at the same time,
It is one of the I was going to say that is one of the good things about Vermont is that we have a lot of these small little historical societies that have limited resources, but sometimes really good stuff. And it gives you this broader network to draw on. And then having, you know, VHS up in Barrie too with your collections, and then Shelburne, of course, we have enough high quality institutions in the state and high quality collections out there that you can get pretty much everything without having to own one of everything, which is something that I struggle with explaining to my collections committee and my curator, and our old director, our new director, thank God, is much more amenable to this idea of, no, you don't have to have two of everything. We are not Noah's Ark. But one of the problems that I end up with is that our curator in particular, and this is just the nature of who he is a collector. He wants stuff. He wants to own the stuff.
Right.
And he has this idea that we need to have two of everything. And, oh, well, we might want to do an exhibit on that someday, so we should have this. And I keep trying to make this argument that if this isn't something that we're going to actively use, it doesn't need to be taking up space in storage, because there is a cost to that. And yes, there's a cost to getting loans, but there's also a cost to having this hanging out on a shelf in storage, collecting dust, and not actually being used. And I haven't yet found a way to really get through to him there, but I'm working on it. Aside from hitting him over the head with a blunt object, I don't know what I'll do.
You mentioned that you have online, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what institution you're at, but you mentioned you had online collections. Is that something that could be like a talking point? Maybe to be like, if we deaccession these things, but we record, I don't know, like putting your accessions digitally acceptable online or something. That's so different. Oh my
Yes, that's something that I would like to do. And one of the things that, one of the things with getting this collections development plan together, what I think that's really going to help us with is get us focused on like the specific stories that we tell. And I found the most wonderful example from the New Bedford Whaling Museum of just the most perfect collections development plan I've ever seen in my life. It is a thing of great beauty if you have not already seen it. So I need to write something like that for us. Like, it looks at specific parts of the collection, specifically what they have, what they should have, and what can go, which I just thought it was absolutely amazing. And I need to write something like that for Bennington, because we need that kind of guidance, because we end up having the same argument every single collections committee meeting about, you know, what is our region? Do we really need extra Grandma Moses paintings? Do we need this many extra Grandma Moses paintings? Do we need this many Forest Moses paintings? Well, no, we don't really need any of those things. We need more really good masterpieces. We don't need all of these extra bits and pieces of, you know, stuff owned by her, but that's what people offer us. So that's what we end up collecting.
One thing that we did as part of my grading report was a broad definition of what is a duplicate. So instead of something being an exact duplicate, it's something that tells the same story in the same way. And then also outlining in there that you only need enough for necessary rotations of a permanent exhibit. So if you have a permanent exhibit of quilts, then you need more duplicates of that because they rotate, as opposed to ceramics, because you don't have to rotate them. I know that paintings do, so you do need some backup, but maybe a definition of duplicates that say that Grandma Moses paintings within this time period that show this type of thing are all duplicates of each other, and we only need 3 of this. Could help if you really stat it up.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. I really want to get a copy of this tiering or this grading sheet that you have. It sounds incredibly useful.
What is your, don't say your email out loud because we're putting this on YouTube, but I'll get your email and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I'll send it to you after this.
Okay.
Definitely.
When I think we're right at time, are we booked for an hour? Because if we're booked for more, then I also made a PowerPoint on direct costs.
So we are, typically it's booked for an hour, but it's also one of those things if people want to hear more, I'm happy to keep us going on this. If we feel like we're good, you know, I can always share resources other ways as well. So it's up to everybody's here.
I'm very interested in direct costs. If we don't have time, if I could get a copy of your PowerPoint, I would be curious.
I mean, I don't mind.
I'm here. Keep it going if you want.
Let me go through this sharing screen fiasco again. First it's this, no. Okay. And it is. Oh my goodness. Gonna use up all my time just trying to share screens. Okay. Can you all see this? Yeah, all right. All right, so AAM has recently upped their standards, and now you must disclose your deaccessioning policy to the public. And if you allow funds to be used for direct care, you also must define that within your collections policy. So they released these standards of how you determine whether something is direct care. It has to enhance the life, usefulness, or quality of an object. It must be a strategic decision based on an institutional plan, collections policy, or conservation assessment. It must have a physical impact on an object in the collection. It must improve the physical condition of an object in the collection rather than benefiting the operation of the entire institution. The decision must be made outside of financial pressure. It has to be a cost that you would not normally just spend in your operating budget, and you have to be able to clearly explain it to your stakeholders in the public. So some examples of direct care, of course, include conservation services, treatment of objects done by conservators. It also, I was surprised to learn, includes environmental monitoring equipment, so data loggers, light meters, and UV light filters, overlights that will be shining on collections. Archival supplies used for storage hardware, and conservation of historic structures if that historic structure is interpreted and accessioned into your collection. It becomes confusing because it does not include building maintenance. So it only includes stuff that you've done a preservation report on the building. And it can include cost shares for grants, but does not include the time that it takes you to apply for the grant. So stuff that is not direct care are staff salaries, interns, even within the collections department, facilities maintenance that impact collection but benefit the whole institution, institution-wide pest management contracts, and exhibit, casework, mounts, and lighting fixtures. So I have laid out why these are not direct care. Staff salaries are a regular part of your budget. Facilities maintenance benefits the entire institution. Institution-wide pest management also benefits the entire institution. And exhibition, casework, etc., is usually a regular part of your budget and does not impact the physical condition of the object. And for discussion, are these direct care? I've seen in some collections management policies, they have outlined maintenance of their database as direct care, and I've seen some that have excluded it from that. What are your all's takes? I personally would not put them under direct care because they don't impact the physical condition of the objects. Though your database is only benefiting the collections, not the institution as a whole. But the argument can be made that maintaining a good database and thus making everything available and searchable online is benefiting the institution as a whole. Any thoughts?
So we had a one specific donor. So it was an in-house system that we were using before. And there were a lot of like bugs with that program. And so we made the conversion over to Proficio, and it was funded by one particular donor. And I think because of that, we never considered having it be included. But as the registrar, I could totally make the argument that it was money worth spending, and that if there's an institution that isn't using a cloud-based system or anything electronic yet, that, yeah, I totally could make the argument, because it's has changed so much of the way that we catalog and work with that data. So that is really interesting. I don't know. Now I'm like, and if that funding were to fall through because of the yearly subscription, I would hope that, yeah, we could maybe get funding from elsewhere. But yeah, I don't know. It's not, now I'm like going down this like psychological or theoretical wormhole, you know?
Yeah, that's
I would think not, because it's, I mean, it's sort of like the roof over your storage room. It's something that's there anyway that, yes, of course it's valuable. Of course you need it. Of course you can't take care of your collections without it. But it seems like it's part of your regular budget and something that's there anyway. I could see making an argument for it if you wanted to. And I could see it being a very believable argument. I'm just not sure that I would necessarily make it.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and having seen it in going in both directions in different collections management policies, I know that it's not one that has a single legally agreed on answer. And it could even be a little bit more nuanced. I don't know that I would ever say that regular subscriptions would be a direct cost because it's a normal amount of your operating budget by the time that you have it. But if your collections database exploded and you needed to replace it, then it might be that one-time fee. All right, maybe my next one's not as difficult. So if you had, if your collections storage was on its own system and you upgraded the HVAC that only affected storage and it didn't affect everyone's offices, would that be direct care or would it be regular buildings maintenance?
I would think that would be regular buildings maintenance. But again, I could see you making the argument for direct care. I mean, we recently put in a small portable dehumidifier into our collection storage. We don't currently, our collections management policy doesn't currently involve things like this as direct care, but I could definitely see the argument made for it.
Yeah, I know that we would consider a portable dehumidifier to be direct care. I'm not sure how we would see our HVAC because we do have it all on our storage is on their own air handlers. My previous position did write HVAC into their direct care policy, but it was an argument that it got added, but I don't know if it got really decided. All right, so say you have to move storage. Are supplies for that move direct care? And I personally think that that would be a yes, but is hiring contractors to help with the move direct care? Because on the one hand, if you contract out conservation, you do pay labor to the conservator and that counts as direct care. But if you do in-house conservation, you don't count your salary. You can't apply that to direct care. So it's paying the wages of contractors to help with a small defined move, direct care, or operating costs.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that if you're doing in-house conservation, if you have an in-house conservator and you're doing in-house conservation, then I would think that their salary would certainly count as direct care as well. I mean, we don't have a conservator on staff, but I would certainly think that would count. And in this case, certainly, because it is a specific project that you don't get any more direct care than that.
All right, and then I've put, these are things that I know have used deaccessioning supplies at places that I've been, but are also things that are purchased on the regular. Can you use deaccessioning funds?
What else would you be purchasing?
What's this?
What else would you be purchasing object labeling supplies for, if not direct care of your collections?
Right. Yeah, and that's.
And I guess nitrile gloves, and maybe you could, but they both seem pretty direct care to me.
Yeah. The only thing that makes it iffy is that it's something that's not normally considered part of the museum's operating budget. So I added that because they're costs that you are making, say, on a monthly or every 6 months basis, that you generally do have worked into your departmental budget.
I also think, like, while we're going through these, I think this is so relevant to our current situation as well, because we've been put on a budget freeze, and we just went over our losses, and this is like a really large festival season for us as well. So maybe, and now I'm thinking, like, we don't really have we have a definition, and we allude to the fact that direct care is covered by that budget, but now really firming that up and making it crystal clear, or providing these opportunities for spending might be a really good way to compensate and provide the best care with funds in a time where we're not really supposed to be making purchases or anything else. So this is great. I really am finding it to be relevant.
But with that, you do run into that is the decision being made without pressure.
Yeah. But and then that's like a whole, because like if this continues the way it is.
But the argument could be made too that you're not deaccessioning things because of the financial pressure, which could rule that out.
Right. It's just the spending.
I have a related question that this doesn't have anything to do with direct care, but more with deaccessioning in general. Given the current economic state of affairs everywhere, we were planning on doing a lot of deaccessioning anyway. Is there any concern about this looking like we're doing it for more economic reasons? Because I don't want people think that we're just selling off our glass collection because we need to pay the light bills. I mean, we're selling off glass collection because it has nothing to do with Vermont.
Right.
And but we need to make sure that we're very open about that. And I guess I'm concerned that people won't see it.
Yeah, that's always a concern. And I think no matter how open you are with it, people are going to initially assume that you're using them to pay salaries and keep on the lights. So a really easy to read statement, so not legalese, just in layman's terms, that outlines everything that you can use your money for, is very important, not just for yourself as an institution and covering your backs, but for the public. And I think that is probably why they added the final one, I had to point it at it with my hand. Can this decision be clearly explained to the stakeholders and the public? And in my mind, the clearly explained also means in a tiny soundbite. So if you get interviewed and the only thing they play is one sentence, can that one sentence make it clear that you're using it only for collections care and maintenance purposes?
So my other question is that AAMD has recently relaxed their guidelines. So is that something that we're taking into account as well?
We're not an art museum, so it doesn't affect us at all. I don't know how if Bennington Museum is a member of it or not.
We're not a member, but just more as a general, it's something that people are aware of, and people certainly don't differentiate between AAM and AAMD and ALSLH,
right?
But they certainly don't care if you're a member of these particular groups. Mm-hmm. It's more of a general awareness issue, I think.
Yeah, I know that we're not changing any of our methods or expanding what we would be deaccessioning. I think what has been more on our radar has been what the market's going to do. So if deaccessioning now is really kicking ourselves in the foot because all we're gaining is space and no help for direct costs. So whether this is something that should be off because of
glass. I mean, the market for glass has been miserable for years now anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's terrible. And it seems like at least from what I've heard, the art market in general and the antiques market is stronger than you would expect these days, but it's only for really high-end material. And while we do have some high-end material that I would like to get rid of, a lot of what we have is not, but I still really want to get rid of it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when it comes to the public, it's so nuanced that I don't know that there's anything that we could do to make it ultra clear. But I think that that's an issue no matter what is happening in the world, even when it's just normal deaccessioning.
I want you to finish with your presentation, but I do have a question or challenge that I've been facing. So we have a bunch of objects, they're anchors and dredging equipment that have been left outside. They're accessioned, most of them. How have you ever had the experience, or how do you handle internally and institutionally, like I am like, we have to deaccession these things, they are not being taken care of, they have no information, they are like the perfect contender. But then there's this interesting thing with exhibits that's happening where they're like, well, let's lay it out, let's put it here, let's add to our campus, so then now there's a lot of things that are in poor condition that will not be like keels of boats, things that look to the public like junk. I mean, even if you provide that context, so I guess it's more of an exhibit to collections, even though it would be deaccession, not part of the collection. But the need to want to interpret everything and not sell and get out the door and move on. So I don't know if anyone else has ever had that issue, and has any advice of how to handle it.
I've dealt with that exact thing at Montpelier, where we had garden statues. No indication that they had anything to do with the property, and they were outside, not being conserved. And because you have to treat all of your accessioned objects with equal respect and value, we made the argument that we either had to completely conserve these and bring them inside, or we had to deaccession them. And that was the argument that finally won everyone over, that if you want to keep these out on display, then it has to be deaccessioned. And what we did for that was we created a prop collection. So we deaccessioned them to ourselves. They were officially out of the collection, which meant that if they ever needed to be stored anywhere, they could not go into storage. That was our most important stipulation. And that the other department, the department that wanted them, was fully in charge of them. So we had no interaction with those arguments. In our case, it was the education department was in charge. So if they wanted to keep them, they had to maintain them as well. So we didn't have to expend any of our resources, the resources being time and tracking them in the database and any kind of maintenance. And then if they want to get rid of them, they're not accessioned, so they can just get rid of them.
Okay. I guess I'm thinking of it more, and maybe that's because I'm overstepping like what my role is. But I'm thinking it more like if we start putting these objects everywhere, we lose value. Like, so we're all in the same department. That's what our organizational structure is. It's exhibits and collections under curatorial. And if we keep putting these objects outside and they are deaccessioned, and we're all on the same page, but they're not getting the necessary, like, they're not getting conserved, like, even on a basic level, what does that show to the public? Because even if they're not conserved and they're not accessioned, somebody walking through the parking lot will think that's a museum object. That's just the public, perception. So I think that's the battle that I'm currently having, and I'm not sure where stepping into it is too far out of my wheelhouse, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel you there. At my last place, we deaccessioned some things to the education department that ended up going into hands-on boxes for schools. And they weren't accessioned, but they were old objects, so people thought we were letting children just handle museum stuff. And there was a discussion at the beginning that does this make us look bad? Are people going to think that we're treating our collection like this? And it ultimately got ignored because people will do what they want to do. And it wasn't until we got the public saying to us, "Are you letting people do this with your collection?" that it finally hit home. So I think in your situation, you'll just have to wait for a couple of Yelp reviews that say, "Don't donate your boat here," because they'll set it outside and let it get destroyed.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. So thanks.
Well, and I think that the nitrile gloves might have been my last question. Oh, nope. Okay. Yeah, this is my last one. So can you use them for general conservation supplies that you don't have a project for?
Unless you're going to be using those conservation supplies for something other than direct object care, I guess I don't see why not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if this is part of your regular budget, I don't know. I think that's an obvious yes.
Yeah, I would agree that that they count as direct care. The only times that I would be uncertain is if it was attached to a named fund. because then you couldn't really attach that name onto the object. But yeah, and then a fairly easy one. All right, were there any other questions that came up that we didn't cover? All right, well, thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. And again, this will be up on our YouTube. And if we'll try to share resources there as well that we can. And then again, obviously, touch base with Teresa. Her email's on our website, vermonthistory.org, if you need it. So it's good to go. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
See ya.
Thanks. Bye.